everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Melanie Road. She was a bright and beautiful teenage girl who went on a night out with friends one evening and never returned home. When Melanie was later found murdered, the police worked tirelessly for so many years to try and catch her killer, but it would be more than 3 decades before they were identified and Melanie finally received some justice. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a huge thank you to Babbel for kindly sponsoring this section of the video. Babbel is a language learning app and it's the best app of its kind in my opinion because it's helping me so much to speak the languages that I have always wanted to learn. Although I swear, since using Babbel, I've now got this like language learning bug. I literally want to learn as many languages as I can. Now I'm really hoping to go to Italy at some point in the next 2 years or so. I've never been before, but I've always wanted to go to Rome. It just looks so beautiful. And I'm determined that by the time I go, I will be able to speak to and understand the people there. And to do that, I'm of course going to be using Babbel to learn Italian. I've only just started learning Italian on Babbel, but I've already picked up a couple of useful phrases. For example, buonasera come sta, which means good evening, how are you? The main thing I've always loved about Babbel is the fact that they teach you the language in multiple different ways, all of which are really engaging and fun so that you actually enjoy the process of learning a whole new vocabulary. They'll teach you through lessons in which there are reading, listening, writing and speaking tasks, but also they can teach you through podcasts and games and videos, and they also offer live classes with top language teachers. In fact, all of the lessons on Babbel are designed by real language teachers and the classes themselves are usually quite short, which I find is perfect for me because it means that even when I've got a super busy day, I can still squeeze in a 10-minute lesson on Babbel and keep up with my learning.
Buongiorno.
Buongiorno.
Buonasera.
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 Yay! I got 7 out of 8. Quite good. So if you would like to learn Italian like me, or French, or Spanish, or German, Portuguese, Russian, there are so many that you can learn on there, then right now is the perfect opportunity to start because if you click on the link in my description box, then you can get up to 65% off your Babbel subscription with a 20-day money-back guarantee. Once again, a massive thank you to Babbel for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel, and now let's just get into the case. So for today's case, we are going all the way back to the year 1984 in Bath, which is a city, the largest city in the county of Somerset, which is in the southwest of England, where I'm from. Bath is honestly a very beautiful city, and I speak from experience there because I've been to Bath many times and it's just a lovely place. It has a population of just under 90,000 people and a lot of tourists like to explore the city every year. However, despite how many people live there and visit there, it's actually a very safe area. Crime rates in Bath are pretty low. This is Melanie Ann Road. She was a 17-year-old girl and she was born in 1966. Melanie lived with her parents. Her mother was called Jean Road, and unfortunately I couldn't actually find the name of her father, but I do know that her mother and father were together when this case took place. And Melanie also had 2 siblings. She had an older sister called Karen and an older brother called Adrian. So Melanie was really the baby of the family. In fact, her sister Karen said that they all used to call her the little duckling, which is so sweet. Melanie's siblings, Karen and Adrian, didn't actually live with the rest of the family at this time in 1984. Karen lived about 2 hours away with her husband and children, and Adrian was away at college in Scotland. So it was just Melanie at home with her parents, and they lived on St. Stephen's Close in Bath. Although they hadn't always lived in Bath, they only moved to the city about 2 years before, so they were relatively new to the area. But despite that, Melanie loved it there. She settled in really well and she was happy in Bath. Melanie Road was described as being a very bright and intelligent and vivacious young girl that everybody just absolutely loved. You would have found it very difficult to find someone that didn't like Melanie Road. She was just a very easy person to get on with, I think. She never argued with anyone and she was very popular. She was so popular, in fact, that she was chosen to be the deputy head girl of her high school. She had a lot of friends in school. She also had a boyfriend, and in June of 1984 she was getting ready to sit her A-level exam, so she was studying and revising a lot. She was working really hard to achieve the grades that she wanted, high grades, because her plan was to go to university when school had ended. And there's no doubt in anyone's minds that Melanie would have passed those exams with flying colours, just because she was so smart and her intelligence would have gotten her a place at pretty much any university in the country. Melanie Road had a really bright future ahead of her. The world was her oyster at 17 years old. However, in 1984, that future was cruelly snatched away from Melanie when she was attacked and murdered one summer night. It was the 8th of June 1984, which was a Friday, and that day Melanie had been out with her friends. They had played a few games of tennis together, and then later on that evening she decided that she was going to go on a night out with her boyfriend and a couple of other friends. And by all accounts, she had a really good time on this night out. They visited a few different bars and clubs in Bath's city centre. They had a couple of drinks, and then at around 2 a.m. the group decided that they were ready to go home and go to bed. So Melanie said goodbye to her boyfriend and her friends, and she was getting ready to walk back to her house on St. Stephen's Close, which was about half an hour away from where she was at this point. Of course, it was the early hours of Saturday morning. It was dark outside, and so her boyfriend said to Melanie, "Look, why don't you get a taxi home? I've got money, I don't mind paying for it." However, Melanie declined the offer. She said that she wanted to walk home. It was a route that she knew very well and had taken many times before, and she felt comfortable doing it. And so she left her friends and she began her journey. But Melanie Road never actually made it home that night. Just a couple of hours after Melanie set off at around 5 to 5:30 a.m. that Saturday morning, the local milkman and his son made a horrifying discovery. The milkman was a man named Tony, and that day started off as any other for him and his 11-year-old son Ian. They were just driving around Bath, dropping off bottles of milk on people's doorsteps, and when they got to a road called St. Stephen's Court, Ian did his job. He started grabbing some bottles of milk and placing them outside the houses, whilst his father was doing the same nearby. However, it was when 11-year-old Ian started walking up a little slope towards another house that he spotted something. It looked like there was a human body just lying in the road. So Ian immediately panicked and he shouted and ran back to his father Tony, and he said, "Dad, there's someone up there led down in the road." And Tony said, "Okay, jump in the car and we'll drive up and take a closer look." So Tony began driving, and when they got around the corner, he also spotted what his son had seen. But at first, Tony actually thought that it was just a tailor's dummy or a mannequin or something like that lying on the ground. However, when they got closer, all became clear to Tony. This wasn't a mannequin. This was a real human body. It was the body of a young woman. She was led on her back and she was just completely covered in blood. She was in a pool of blood. so it was obvious that she had been the target of some kind of brutal attack. Tony immediately checked the body for signs of life. He checked for a pulse, but he couldn't feel one, and the body was cold and it was pale, indicating that this person had been dead for a while, for a few hours at least. So Tony knocked on the door of one of the houses nearby and he used their telephone to call the police. When the police arrived at the scene, they sectioned off the area where the young woman's body was found, and a forensic team and pathologist were also called in to assist with this inquiry. One of the first things the police knew that they needed to do was obviously identify this woman, figure out who she was, because if they can do that, hopefully they can find out what happened and who did this to her sooner. And it didn't actually take very long for the police to do this, because when they arrived at the scene, one of the first things they found was a keyring. It was on top of a wall near the garages where the young woman's body was found, and this keyring had a name scratched or carved into the wood, and this name was Melanie. So of course it was at this point that the police believed that this victim was probably called Melanie. But Melanie who? What was her last name? Where did she live? Was she from around here? The police needed to know more. And so in an attempt to find out more and fully identify her, a police officer literally just started driving around in a police car. He was driving around the area and he was using like a megaphone to shout out the name Melanie. He was saying, "Melanie, Melanie, does anyone know a girl called Melanie? Does anyone know of a Melanie that is missing right now?" They were obviously hoping that someone, maybe a friend or a family member of someone called Melanie, would hear it and run out and say, "Yes, I know a Melanie." And in the end, that is exactly what happened. A woman who heard this police officer shouting ran out of her house. She ran up to the police car and she said to the officer, "I have a daughter called Melanie and she's not in her bed. She didn't come home last night." And as I'm sure you've probably guessed by now, this woman, this mother, was Jean Road. And her daughter was Melanie Road, who had been on a night out the evening before and never arrived home. And it was after this that the police had to break the awful news to Jean that they had found a dead body and that they now believed it was her child, Melanie Road. And it was Melanie Road. She had been attacked and murdered during her walk home the previous night at some point in the early hours of Saturday morning. And it turns out that Melanie was killed just yards away from her home. I think it was like 200 meters away from her house. As I mentioned earlier, her body was found on a road called St. Stephen's Court, which I think is just around the corner from St. Stephen's Close, where Melanie lived with her family. So she was literally minutes or even seconds away from her home when she was brutally attacked and left to die. Like I said, when Melanie was found, she was lying in a pool of blood. There was blood everywhere, and this blood had come from stab wounds that she sustained. She had been stabbed repeatedly with a knife, although no knife was found at the scene, so the killer must have taken that with them. And I don't believe the knife, the murder weapon, has ever been found to this day. In total, Melanie was stabbed about 26 times, many of which were in her chest area, and she had also been raped by her killer, so this crime was clearly sexually motivated. Now, a lot of the stab wounds that Melanie sustained were very deep, which were obviously the ones that killed her. However, one thing that the pathologist noticed in Melanie's post-mortem was that many of the stab wounds were actually quite shallow, if that's the right word to use. Basically, she had a lot of stab wounds on her front in her chest area, as I said, but she also had stab wounds in her back. Now, the stab wounds in her front were the very deep ones, whereas the ones in her back weren't so much. They weren't very deep, which indicated to the police that at the start of the attack, when she was first approached by the murderer, he threatened her with the knife from behind. So it was like he was standing behind her and began prodding and poking her back with the knife to force her to move to where he wanted her. And that was how she got the more shallow stab wounds in her back. And then after this is when she sustained the deep stab wounds to her front, which would have caused her to bleed out and ultimately led to her death. However, interestingly, the forensic team didn't just find Melanie's blood at the scene. Of course, the majority of it was her blood, but they also found traces of another person's blood, which they obviously believed was probably the killer's. And the presence of the killer's blood at the scene indicated that the killer himself had been injured during the attack. Maybe whilst Melanie was trying to defend herself and fight him off, the knife slipped and he cut himself, causing him to drip blood. Traces of the killer's blood was found alongside Melanie's blood around the area where her body was left. However, the police also discovered that the killer had actually accidentally left a blood trail. They noticed little drops of blood on the ground leading away from the crime scene where the killer had walked away from Melanie's body after the attack. So the police followed this blood trail, these tiny spots of blood on the ground, and every time they found a new spot, they would circle around it with chalk until eventually the trail stopped about half a mile away from the murder scene. So eventually the killer either stopped bleeding, or maybe he finally noticed that he was bleeding, and so he pressed against the wound to stop it from dripping blood onto the ground. In total, the forensic team found 86 spots of blood leading away from the crime scene, and after each one had been circled, they took swabs of every single one. Some of these blood spots they determined was Melanie's blood, it was her blood type, so the killer obviously still had Melanie's blood on him when he walked away from the scene, and that dripped off of him as he walked. And the other blood spots the police believed were the killer's blood, and when they tested it, they actually found that the killer had a very rare blood type. In fact, only 3% of the population had this blood type at the time, so it was very unique, which was a bit of a relief for the police in a way. If only 3% of the population had this blood type, then hopefully it wouldn't be too difficult to narrow down a list of suspects, because not many men in the Bath area would belong to this blood group. Now, unfortunately, at the time in the early 80s, DNA analysis wasn't even really a thing, or at least it was very, very new in 1984, and therefore not very good. So they couldn't concretely identify a person through a blood sample, and there also weren't any DNA databases in England back then, obviously. So all the police could really do at this point when Melanie's murder happened was they could take someone's DNA, their blood sample, and determine whether or not it was the same blood group as the killer's. If it wasn't, they were ruled out. If it was, then they would start looking into that person a little bit more in case they were the perpetrator. So that is exactly what the police started doing. They started taking blood samples from as many men in Bath as they possibly could, and following that they would test it to see which blood group it belonged to. As well as taking samples from the residents of Bath, they also tried to track down all of the men that were visiting and touring Bath at the time of Melanie's murder and asking them for their blood samples too. The police honestly took thousands and thousands of blood samples, and they arrested and questioned countless men. But despite this, no one was ever charged with Melanie's murder. They couldn't find her killer. And unfortunately, as the months went by, the investigation into Melanie's murder, which was named Operation Rhodium by the police, just started to go quiet and go cold. The police never gave up on it. They would still do public appeals. They would still take blood samples and test them. They would still question and take statements from people. But sadly, none of this work brought them any closer to identifying Melanie's killer. They were just really struggling because they didn't really have too much to go on. They had the DNA evidence, but of course, due to the limitations in forensic science, it couldn't tell them much at this time. And on top of that, they didn't have any witnesses. There didn't seem to be any witnesses to the murder. No one saw the attack. No one saw the perpetrator's face because Melanie was targeted and killed in the middle of the night. And so the case remained unsolved. Fast forward to the year 1995. So this was about 11 years after this crime took place. There was actually a review into Melanie Road's case, because by this point in England, there was a DNA database. I believe the DNA database was actually established in England and Wales in 1995. So it was a very new thing. And now with the advancements in DNA and forensic technology, the police could actually take the DNA evidence they already had in this case and develop it into a DNA profile of the offender, and then they could use this DNA profile to search the DNA database to see if there was a match. As we know, the police had the killer's blood stored from where he had injured himself during the attack on Melanie, and they also had his semen. Like I said earlier, Melanie was raped by the murderer, so they found traces of his semen on her body. So using this DNA evidence, the police searched the new database, but unfortunately there were no matches. The offender's DNA was not on there. So this was another setback for the police, and I imagine it must have just been incredibly frustrating for them because they had the evidence, the DNA evidence was there, but they just could not find a match. But then in 1996, so this was 12 years after Melanie Road was murdered, another young woman disappeared from Bath, and people began theorising that maybe the person responsible for this young woman's disappearance was Melanie's murderer. Maybe he had returned and decided that he was going to kill again. And what's absolutely crazy about the disappearance of this second young woman is that it is so similar to Melanie Road's case, even down to the name. This woman was also called Melanie. Her full name was Melanie Hall, and some of you may actually recognise that name because I've actually covered Melanie Hall's case before. It was well over a year ago now. If you would like to watch that video, I will leave it linked in the description box, but just to refresh your memory, Melanie Hall was a 25-year-old woman originally from Bradford-on-Avon. However, she worked in a hospital in Bath at the time of her disappearance. And what's even crazier about Melanie Hall's case is that she went missing literally on the same day as Melanie Road's murder. As we know, Melanie Road was killed in the early hours of the morning on the 9th of June 1984. And Melanie Hall went missing in the early hours of the morning on the 9th of June 1996. So the same day, the 9th of June, and around the same time, but just 12 years apart. But the similarities didn't even stop there, because Melanie Hall also vanished after she had been on a night out with her boyfriend and friends, just like Melanie Road. Melanie Hall was out drinking that evening at a nightclub called Cadillac's in Bath. However, after she left the nightclub on her own, she was never seen alive again. She never returned home, she didn't turn up for work a few days later, and she didn't get in contact with anyone to let them know where she was, and so her parents reported her as missing to the police. One difference between the cases, however, is that obviously Melanie Road's body was found before her parents even realised that she was missing. She was found just hours after she was murdered, whereas no body was found in Melanie Hall's case. The police could not find her anywhere. No one had any clue where she was. But it was when Melanie Hall went missing that people started thinking, well, hang on, maybe there's a connection here. Maybe the person responsible for Melanie Hall's disappearance is the same person that murdered Melanie Road 12 years earlier. I mean, there were just so many similarities for people not to think that. They were both young women called Melanie. They both disappeared after being on a night out in Bath, and both their cases happened on the same day, the 9th of June. And the police thought the same, and they did look into the possibility that perhaps these two cases were connected. However, they could never concretely link them because no one even knew if Melanie Hall was dead or alive because they couldn't find a body. Melanie Hall's case remained unsolved for years and years, and in 2004, 8 years after she was last seen, she was actually declared legally dead despite no body being found. But I think that this was just to give her parents and her family some closure. They did not believe that she was still alive out there somewhere. They believed that she had passed away, and so they wanted her to be declared legally dead. And so the search for a body continued, and in the autumn of 2009, over 13 years after Melanie Hall went missing, there was a huge development in her case when human remains were found. It was the 5th of October 2009 when a workman was clearing rubbish and undergrowth from the side of a slip road at junction 14 on the N5 motorway near Thornbury in South Gloucestershire, which is just under 27 miles away from Bath. Anyway, he was going through and clearing this undergrowth when he came across a black bag, a black bin liner, and when he pulled the bag towards him, he was completely shocked because a couple of bones fell out of it. So this workman immediately called the police, who searched around the area, and they found even more bones, including a skull, all of which were confirmed to have been human. These were human remains. Although this wasn't actually a full skeleton, this person had been dismembered after their death, and then their body parts had been placed in these bin liners to decompose. And these human remains were eventually identified as belonging to 25-year-old Melanie Hall. Finally, after so many years, they had found her body. It was determined that Melanie's cause of death was probably from blunt force trauma to the head, since the skull that was found was fractured, as were her cheekbone and jaw. And when all of this evidence was sent off for forensic testing, scientists actually found traces of DNA from some blue rope that had been used to tie the bin bags containing Melanie's remains together. And so for that reason, they strongly believed that this DNA belonged to her killer. But despite her remains now being found, just like Melanie Road's murder, Melanie Hall's case remained unsolved. Police couldn't find her killer either. But going back to the case of Melanie Road, so as I said, there was a review into her case in 1995, and the police searched the new DNA database to see if anyone on there was a match to the DNA they had of Melanie's killer. But no one was. The killer was not on the database. And so the police's next port of call was to go back through all of the persons or people of interest that they had previously had in the case over the years. Because like we talked about earlier, in 1984, when Melanie was murdered, all they could do was take people's blood samples and determine through them whether or not they had the same blood type as the killer. But even if they did, of course, that's not concrete proof that they were her murderer. And so they decided to go back through the list of all of the people that they took samples from after Melanie's murder that did have the same blood type, and they decided to obtain their DNA again. Because by this time, DNA analysis had developed and advanced so much, so scientists would be able to determine for definite whether or not any of them were Melanie's killer. However, even after they swabbed everyone, all of their previous people of interest, there was still no match. And unfortunately, after this line of inquiry dried up, Melanie's case went cold once again. They continued swabbing several people over the years, but nothing came of it. The killer still remained undetected, and the case remained cold for a number of years once again, until there was another review into Melanie's case in 2014, which was the year that marked the 30th anniversary of Melanie's death. And this cold case review was headed by DCI Julie McKay, who had been a part of Operation Rhodium, the investigation into Melanie's death, since around 2009 time. And Julie was absolutely determined to get some answers for Melanie's family and solve this case. She actually always said that she had this gut feeling that one day she would find the person that did this to Melanie, and her gut feeling was right. As part of this cold case review, Julie and her team decided to use a relatively new technique called familial DNA profiling. Now, if you don't know what familial DNA profiling is, it's basically where the police will try and search the DNA database for anyone on there that may be biologically related to the killer that they're looking for. Because as we know, in this case, they had Melanie's killer's DNA, but there was no match to it stored on the database. But if they searched the database for a familial link to their killer's DNA profile, maybe they would find something, because obviously a relative would have very similar DNA to the murderer. It would be almost identical. Now, the first familial DNA run that they did in this case actually happened, I believe, around 2009-2010 time, and it didn't result in anything. It did provide a list of people who may have been biologically related to the killer, but when all of these were looked into and swabbed, there was still nothing. None of these people were actually family members of the murderer. It's just their DNA was kind of similar. So that was a dead end. However, after a couple of years, the detectives decided to run a familial DNA search again to see if anyone new would come up, to see if in that gap of time between the first familial DNA run and the second, someone related to the killer had had their DNA put into the database. It was 2014 when the detectives were given the go-ahead to do the second familial DNA run, and it turns out that about 1 million new people had been entered into the database since their first familial DNA run. So they were desperately hoping that one of these 1 million people was a relative of Melanie's killer. And when the results came back, they were once again given a list of people that may have had a familial link to the offender. And right at the top of the list, there was a new name, a new person that had recently been added to the database and who had very, very similar DNA to Melanie Road's killer's DNA profile. And so the detectives started looking into this person. It was actually a woman, and her name was Claire Hampton, and she was 41 years old. And her DNA profile had recently been added to the DNA database because she had been arrested following a domestic dispute with her boyfriend. I don't think she was charged with anything, but because she had been arrested, of course, she was required by law to provide a DNA sample, and then that sample was uploaded onto the database. And then shortly after this is when the detectives investigating Melanie Road's case did the second rerun of the familial DNA search, and Claire's DNA profile was the one at the very top of the list. Her DNA was incredibly similar to the attacker's DNA, indicating that she probably had some relation to Melanie's murderer. Maybe it was her father or a grandfather or an uncle of hers. And so as soon as her name came up, Detective Gary Mason immediately got in contact with Claire, and he started just asking her about her family tree. And it was following this phone call that the detective learned that Claire's father was still alive and that he actually lived in Bath in Somerset in the 1980s. He lived there when Melanie Road was stabbed to death. Claire's father was a man named Christopher Hampton. He was in his early 60s at this time in 2015, so he would have been around 23, 24 at the time of Melanie's murder, I think, and by now he was living in the city of Bristol, I believe, which is about 13 miles away from Bath. So after the detective spoke to Claire, he decided to ring Claire's father, Christopher Hampton, and Hampton answered the call. And the detective basically just explained to Hampton that he was a police officer and that he was investigating the murder of Melanie Road, which happened over 30 years ago in 1984, and that he would need a voluntary DNA swab from Hampton, so that he could be ruled out of the inquiry into Melanie's case. And Hampton agreed. He said that he would be happy to meet with the detective to provide his DNA. The following Monday, Detective Gary Mason and Christopher Hampton met in a car park in Bristol, and the detective firstly just went through everything again. He went over the fact that he was investigating the murder of Melanie Road, and he asked Hampton if he would be able to take a voluntary DNA sample from him to be tested against the DNA that the police had of Melanie's killer. And once again, he said yes, he gave consent for his DNA to be taken. So the detective took some swabs from Hampton, and then these swabs were sent to the lab to be tested alongside some other DNA swabs provided by other men, and now the police just had to wait for the results. A couple of weeks later, I think it was about a month later, the results were in, and to the police's absolute shock, there was actually a match, and the match was to Christopher Hampton. His DNA sample was identical to the DNA the police had of Melanie's killer. It was a match to the semen found on her body and a match to the blood found at the crime scene. Christopher Hampton was the one who murdered Melanie Road all those years ago, which, as I just said, was such a shock to the detectives because of how normal and calm he seemed when they asked him to provide his DNA. He was more than willing to cooperate. He didn't try to avoid the police or anything like that, so they really did not expect him to be the offender, especially because Hampton didn't have any previous criminal history. He had never been arrested before for anything, so it seemed as though his first and only crime was murder. Either that or he's just never been caught for any other crimes. There really isn't much information about Christopher Hampton online and about his background, and I think that that's just because there honestly isn't much to tell. He was married, he had 4 children in total, one of which was obviously his daughter Claire. She was the oldest. He worked as a painter and decorator, and he just seemed like literally any other normal guy, like a nice, normal family man. He did not seem at all like the kind of person that would have been capable of committing such a horrific crime. But this proved that this was concrete scientific evidence that he was a cold-blooded killer, Melanie Road's killer, and he kept this dark secret for more than 3 decades. He never told anyone what he did all those years ago in 1984. His family and the people that were close to him had absolutely no idea until, of course, the police finally made the DNA match. On the 3rd of July 2015, Christopher Hampton was arrested on suspicion of the rape and murder of 17-year-old Melanie Road, and he was at home at the time of his arrest, so his wife was there too. And what's interesting is when the police arrested him and they handcuffed him, his wife actually said to Christopher something along the lines of, "Oh, don't worry, you obviously didn't do it, so you'll be back home later on, I'll see you later." And Christopher actually replied to this saying, "No, you won't." And so his wife said, "Well, I'll see you tomorrow then." But again, he said, "No, you won't." And he said that because he obviously knew that he was never going home again, because he knew that he had done this. So it was like he was just kind of accepting defeat at this point. So he was taken to the police station to be interviewed, although interestingly, despite what he said to his wife when he was arrested, he pretty much refused to say anything, and instead he prepared a statement alongside his solicitor in which he denied everything. He said that he was not responsible for the murder of Melanie Road, but despite his denial, the police still charged him anyway because they knew that he was the killer. They had concrete proof, so he was charged regardless. When it came to Hampton's plea hearing in December of 2015, he decided to plead not guilty to his charges as expected. Again, he was still denying his involvement, and this of course meant that the case had to go to trial. His trial was due to begin on March the 9th, 2016. However, when this trial eventually rolled around, he decided that he was now going to change his plea, and he pled guilty. And no one actually knows why he did this either, why he decided to just suddenly change his plea. But I personally believe that he probably did this simply to try and get a lighter sentence. He obviously realised that there was no point denying it anymore because the DNA evidence against him was just too strong. So he could either plead not guilty and be convicted anyway and receive a hefty prison sentence, or he could plead guilty and hope that that would be taken into consideration when it came to his sentencing. Hopefully he would receive less time for finally owning up to it. Although despite his guilty plea, he has never ever told anyone why he did what he did, why he decided to murder Melanie that night in 1984. We don't know if he was out that night planning to kill someone and Melanie just happened to be that someone. We don't know if it was a spur of the moment thing. He just saw Melanie walking home and decided at that moment to kill. We don't know anything about what led him to commit such an awful crime, and I don't think we will ever know now. I think he will take that information, that secret, to his grave. 64-year-old Christopher Hampton's sentencing took place on the 9th of May 2016, during which the judge sentenced him to life in prison for the rape and murder of 17-year-old Melanie Road, and he was given a minimum term of 22 years. So at the very earliest, he could be released from prison at the age of 86. However, the judge did say that it is very, very unlikely that he would ever be let out. He would more than likely die behind bars, which is no less than he deserves, in my opinion. And that is it for this case. That is the case of Melanie Road. A very sad case, but I'm so glad that her family were finally able to get some closure and some justice for her. It's just such a shame that it took 32 years, I think. I can't even imagine how hard it must have been for them knowing that her killer was out there somewhere and free to live his life when he stole Melanie's. Before I end the video, I do just want to go back to the case of Melanie Hall, because obviously we talked about how similar her case was to Melanie Road's case earlier on. So you're probably thinking, well, are they linked? Was Christopher Hampton Melanie Hall's killer too? And the answer is no, he wasn't. His DNA is not a match to the DNA the police have of Melanie Hall's killer. So he has been officially ruled out as having anything to do with her murder. And unfortunately, Melanie Hall's case still remains unsolved to this day. Her murderer is still out there somewhere, and Melanie's parents, Steve and Patricia Hall, are still searching for answers. So I will be leaving some contact details in the description box in case anyone watching this has any information in relation to the murder of Melanie Hall. If you think that you might know anything, even if you think it's probably really small and insignificant, you never know. So please do get in contact with the police, and hopefully we can get some justice for Melanie Hall too. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. Let me know actually if you think that Christopher Hampton committed other crimes, other murders even, because it's not believed by the police that he did, because they've never been able to link him to anything else. But I just find it so hard to believe that rape and murder was his first and only crime. Like, usually in a killer's background we see that they start off committing smaller petty crimes such as theft and burglary, and then they slowly progress into more serious crimes like sexual assault and homicide. It's very, very rare that a killer will have no previous criminal history and then not commit any crimes after their murders either, but it appears as though Christopher Hampton may have been an exception. He was one of those rarities. Quickly before I go, I do just want to say thank you once again to Babbel for kindly sponsoring this video. Remember, if you click on the link in the description box, then you can get up to 65% off your Babbel subscription with a 20-day money-back guarantee. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Don't forget to switch on the little notification bell, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye!